Thank you for joining us for our sixth discussion on COVID-19. I'm Jennifer Schaefer, Assistant Vice President for Development at the University of Toledo. For today's presentation, please submit all questions via the chat box, and all questions will be answered after the mayor speaks. Now I would like to turn over the meeting to our moderator today, is Dr. Christopher Cooper. Dr. Cooper earned his medical degree from the University of Cincinnati, where he graduated as class valedictorian. He completed his cardiology residency and fellowship programs at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, which is associated with the Harvard College of Medicine. Dr. Cooper has been a part of the University of Toledo for more than 25 years. In the field of cardiology, he is known across the globe and has received more than $25 million in external funding for his research initiatives here at the University of Toledo. His work has been published in numerous journals, such as the New England Journal of Medicine. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Cooper.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Chris Cooper, Dean of the College of Medicine and Life Sciences and Executive Vice President for Clinical Affairs here at the University of Toledo. As a word of introduction, the university's College of Medicine is in the business of discovery through nationally recognized research, patient care, and training of many of our region's physicians, scientists, and other health professionals. And you'll hear more about that today. The compass that guides us is our mission to improve the health in our communities and in our region. And what we know is that there still is a great need for reliable, accurate information about COVID-19. This afternoon, we have a really exciting panel of nationally recognized leaders that include virologists that work on COVID-19, infectious disease specialists on the front lines of COVID-19 care, along with the mayor for the city of Toledo. Our goal today is to get reliable, solid information out to our community that you can trust. I'd like to take a moment to introduce the presenters and the panelists. So first we have Dr. Joan Duggan, who's an infectious disease specialist and professor in the Department of Internal Medicine, as well as a Senior Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs and Development, and the Associate Dean for Professionalism. She earned her medical degree from the Medical College of Ohio and completed an infectious disease fellowship at the University of Michigan. She has received numerous awards, has millions of dollars in funding, and over 130 publications. I'm also really excited to introduce Dr. Matthew Hepburn, who has dedicated his professional career to addressing the threat of infectious diseases and pandemics. He's currently the vaccine development lead for the Countermeasures Acceleration Group, big phrase, formerly known as Operation Warp Speed, a partnership between the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Defense of our national government. This was founded in May of last year to help accelerate the development of COVID-19 vaccines. Dr. Hepburn has served 23 years in the United States Army as an infectious disease physician and retired as a colonel. His accomplishments include the National Strategy for Biosurveillance, which created the policy framework to support advances in public health surveillance applied to the current pandemic. He received his undergrad and medical degree and a degree in biomedical engineering from Duke and completed his infectious disease fellowship and his residency in internal medicine at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio. He most recently received an honorary degree from our College of Medicine, was the 2021 commencement speaker in recognition for all that he's done for our nation. Dr. Jason Huntley will be a speaker today. Jason is an associate professor in medical microbiology and immunology here at the University of Toledo. He's the director of our Biosafety Level 3 laboratory, a specialized high containment lab that allows his research group to study deadly bacteria and viruses like SARS-CoV-2, the virus which causes COVID-19. In fact, later today, I'll mention some of the work that he and his colleagues are doing recently, funded by the National Institutes of Health, that will use that Biosafety Level 3 lab to conduct that research. Dr. Huntley has published extensively on lung infections and vaccine development, and has given invited presentations around the United States and around our world. In January of last year, Dr. Huntley introduced Dr. Anthony Fauci at the National Biothreats Conference in Washington, D.C., and Dr. Fauci opened the nation's eyes to a novel and deadly viral pneumonia sweeping through China, what we now know as COVID-19. Last but not least, we'll enjoy hearing from Mayor Wade Kapszukiewicz, who is our 58th mayor of the city of Toledo, who has served as the Lucas County Treasurer, the Lucas Board of Education, and was a member of the Toledo City Council. In 2006, the mayor was recognized as a 20 under 40 community leader. He received a bachelor's degree in journalism and political science from Marquette University, where he was valedictorian of his class, and then went on to earn his master's degree in public policy from the University of Michigan. So thank you to all our speakers, and let's get the program started. The first topic I'm actually going to speak to briefly, which is about COVID and cardiovascular problems. Next slide, please. We know that there's a relationship between COVID-19 and people with cardiovascular disease. As a word of introduction, I'm a cardiologist and an interventional cardiologist, and have spent my lifetime dealing with people who have cardiovascular diseases. What's been quite interesting is watching the COVID-19 pandemic evolve and seeing the information develop. In fact, last spring, in early spring of 2020, last year, I reviewed one of the first papers coming out of China about this novel viral pneumonia, and how many of the people who were dying, in fact, almost a third of the people who were dying of cardiovascular causes, which was really pretty earth-shattering news. Well, what we have come to understand about COVID-19 is that oftentimes what we find is that if you get really sick, you have some predisposition. And one of the most common ones is high blood pressure. In fact, high blood pressure is a very common finding. It's not universal, but very common in people admitted to intensive care units who have COVID. And what we also know is that people who develop COVID, who have pre-existing cardiovascular disease, are much, much more likely to die. In fact, in a study out of China, if you had no cardiovascular disease and were admitted to an ICU, there was a 2% chance of dying. If you had cardiovascular disease, that increased almost fivefold to 10%. Now, there's been a fair amount of work done over the last year or so to unravel that. And we know some of that relationship is because, in general, people who have cardiovascular disease tend to be somewhat older. And when you pull out the effect of age, that relationship is less strong, but still, there's a 2 to 3-fold increase in risk for death with COVID if you have cardiovascular disease that isn't accountable by other factors such as age. The other thing that we know about COVID is that at the time that somebody presents for care, if we measure their blood tests and we find evidence that their cardiovascular system is affected using measures such as troponin, which is a heart enzyme muscle, those people who have abnormalities of their cardiovascular system at the time that they're diagnosed are much, much likelier to get quite sick, require an ICU stay, or ultimately die of COVID. And we're just beginning to untangle those relationships, why COVID affects the cardiovascular system and why it relates to subsequent adverse things like death or intensive care unit stays. Can I have the next slide, please? So why does COVID affect the heart and blood vessels? Again, we typically think of COVID as a viral infection that affects mostly the lungs. People present, they're short of breath and they have fevers. So why should somebody have a cardiovascular problem with this viral pneumonia? Well, we know that spike protein that there's been lots of conversation about, in fact, the thing that we use to immunize people against COVID, we know that the spike protein attaches to a protein on our body called the ACE2 protein. It turns out that blood vessels express the ACE2 protein. In fact, there's a lining on the inside of the blood vessel. If you think about the like white lining on the inside of a can of green beans that sometimes we see, that similar thing, there's a single cell layer inside of blood vessels called endothelium. The endothelial cells have the ACE2 protein expressed on their outer surface. And so think of it this way. Somebody gets pneumonia from COVID, the COVID virus is in their lungs, the COVID virus enters into the bloodstream through the lungs and it circulates through the blood vessels. Some of those viruses then attach to the lining of the blood vessel, the endothelium. And why that is so important is that endothelium serves in a very important several roles. So one is it prevents blood clots from forming inside the blood vessels. So we know that people with COVID have troubles with blood clots. The second thing is that that endothelium can become inflamed. It can become active, and white blood cells can stick to it if there's problems going on with the endothelium, and that can cause other injuries to the blood vessels and the tissues that are supplied. And so what we now know is that some people who develop COVID develop inflammation of their heart muscle, a problem we call myocarditis, myo being muscle, carditis, heart, and inflammation. So inflammation of the heart muscle, and that can get to be quite serious. What's interesting is that some people vaccinated will also develop myocarditis, but that generally tends to be rare and tends to be mild. So vaccines can get you myocarditis, rare, mild. The myocarditis associated with actually getting COVID tends to be much more severe. And we also know that, as I mentioned, because of this disruption, practically some people with COVID will present with a heart attack or stroke. In fact, what's fascinating is that we know that people who are infected with COVID will often be infectious for a period of days before they get sick. And interestingly, for some people, the very first symptom of COVID may be a stroke or a heart attack. Think about that for a moment. You're exposed, you get sick with COVID, you don't have a fever yet, you don't have a cough, you don't have a shortness of breath, but you have as your first symptom either a heart attack or a stroke because of the blood clotting disorders that can occur around COVID infection. So that's been something that, you know, the science is progressing very rapidly about, so how we understand COVID infection and its effect on the heart. Going back to the study I mentioned a year ago, it was interesting that about a third of people who presented with COVID died of a cardiovascular cause, and many of those were people who subsequently had a heart attack or a stroke or had a heart arrhythmia related to their COVID infection. Now we know the rest of the story, that there were probably people at that time who were developing strokes and heart attacks and who were dying, and nobody even thought to check to see if they'd had COVID. Next slide, please. What's interesting is that we're also getting an appreciation that children can develop COVID-related cardiovascular diseases. And what we think is happening is that same pattern of inflammation that it can occur in adults, which leads to heart attacks and strokes, and can happen, that can happen in children. When we get generalized inflammation of blood vessels in kids, we call that Kawasaki's disease. And in kids, it shows up as aneurysms of blood vessels, which are, you know, the blood vessel enlarging or swelling, clots which may occur, blood clots which occur in those swelled areas of aneurysm or on their own. And children can even have heart attacks in the setting of a COVID infection. And I think this is germane to the development of vaccines and vaccine strategies for adolescents. We now know that COVID's approved for use in people, in children down to the age of 12, and then the ongoing vaccine trials in children under the age of 12, because obviously we'd like to prevent kids from having these kind of problems. And so, you know, more work to be done. Those clinical trials are ongoing to protect children who may develop COVID. The rate of Kawasaki's disease is low, But if it's your kid and your kid gets sick, or your kid gets very sick, it's actually quite meaningful. So again, there's more work to be done, but we do know that even in young children, they can develop this blood vessel inflammation problem, Kawasaki's disease, related to COVID infection. Next slide, please. So the last comment I'll make is that the University of Toledo community has been working pretty hard the last year to be involved in the solutions for the COVID pandemic. We have a group called the Medical Research Society, which funds small grants to help our investigators, our researchers develop novel strategies. Last year, this group came together and funded 3 small projects. One of those projects was some of our scientists, including Dr. Jason Huntley, who you'll hear from shortly. These 3 scientists came together from the fields of medical microbiology and immunology, pharmacology, and physiology to try to help unravel this issue of COVID and cardiovascular disease. And so what this team has done is they've taken a group of rats, rats that will develop high blood pressure early in life, what we call spontaneously hypertensive rats. We know that those animals develop cardiovascular disease at high rates. And what they did is they inserted the gene for ACE2 into that animal's DNA. And so if you see in the panel on your bottom left is a schematic of the double helix of DNA. So they take the gene which codes for ACE2 in that white panel to the right of it, and they targeted the animal's DNA and they inserted the ACE2 gene. And so now what you have is a mouse, or a rat that can be bred that expresses ACE2. And then finally, we tie that in with the BSL-3 lab that Dr. Huntley and Dr. Chattopadhyay work in. And so Dr. Joe, who's an expert in genetics of hypertension, working collaboratively with Dr. Huntley and Dr. Chattopadhyay, have these animals, and we can look at a whole variety of things. It would be very difficult to do in people, right? We can look at, the endothelium, that liner, and see how it's affected by COVID attaching to the ACE2 protein. We can look at the hearts of these animals and understand potentially issues around myocarditis. We can look at the lungs and the blood vessels that flow through the lungs and the other parts of the body. And we can begin to unravel this relationship between COVID and cardiovascular disease. What I would say is that I think most of us are at the spot right now where we believe that COVID is going to be a fixture in the medical community for the foreseeable future. We have very effective vaccines, but we're hearing that there are novel variants come out. We're hearing that people are still not vaccinated, either in the United States or even to a larger degree outside the United States. So we know that there are going to be people who are unvaccinated who are going to get sick. There are people who are vaccinated who are probably going to get less sick, but still may get COVID. And so with all that going on, helping to understand how COVID affects the cardiovascular system and the things that we can do to keep people healthy, even if they get COVID, I think is going to be really meaningful. So I'm going to stop my comments there, and we can move on to the next presenter.
All right, thanks, Dr. Cooper. Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Huntley. Thank you for joining us tonight. It's good to have you. Next slide, please. So as Dr. Cooper just got done talking about, you've heard about the Delta variant. Here are the statistics from the CDC. The CDC releases these approximately every 2 weeks. We should expect an update in the next few days. But if you can look at this graph and focus on that orange bar, you can see over a 2-week time period from June 19th to early July, we went from approximately 20% being the Delta variant to nearly 60%. And again, we're now in the 20th of July. So, the recent numbers, the preliminary numbers indicate that, 80, if not 90% of the variants that we're seeing of COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, the virus, are the Delta variant. Next slide, please. So again, to look at this kind of in region by region, you can see Ohio there, about 44% of the variants that we're detecting here in Ohio are the Delta variant. But if you look out west, in Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, and then even farther out west, in the Colorado, Montana, et cetera area, you can see it's, 80, if not closer to 90%. And again, this data is about 2 weeks old. So the Delta variant is definitely taking over. And what does that mean? If you've read some of the recent reports, the Delta variant is 50% more infectious or contagious than the Beta variant, which was 50% more than the original Alpha. And we know that the amount of virus that the infected people produce is 1,000 times more than the original Alpha variant. So not only is it more infectious, but it's more infectious because people are producing so much more virus with this Delta variant. It's highly transmissible, highly contagious. At this point, the good thing is it doesn't appear that it's causing more severe symptoms. But if we go to the next slide, please. This just shows that vaccines, in fact, do work. In fact, I'm highlighting here with the green arrows, the emergency use authorization for both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines was in kind of mid-December. They were administered. And if you think about people getting the vaccines and then getting their booster shot, let's say in January, you can already see it started going down with that first shot. And then a month later, after some people were already fully vaccinated, you can see the rapid decline in COVID cases. Now, next slide, please. Now, what's disturbing is, in the past 2 weeks, if not the past month, we're seeing a dramatic uptick in cases and hospitalizations. And this is all due to that Delta variant. So, right now, about 50% of the US population is vaccinated. We need to do better. And we need to do better because as we infect more people who are not vaccinated, we're going to be talking about other variants other than this Delta variant. And things could get much, much worse if we don't get more and more people vaccinated. So it's exciting to see that we have a lot of you listening tonight. If you're not vaccinated, please consider getting it. If you know people who are not vaccinated, please help talk to people and encourage them to get vaccinated. These numbers are not good. So next slide, please. So if you are vaccinated and you've gotten either the full one shot, if you've gotten Johnson & Johnson, or you've gotten both of the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines, both the original and the booster, how protective are those against the variants? This is the data we do know. Again, it varies. There's been studies done in Israel, and those numbers seem to be a little bit lower than the studies that have been done in the UK and Canada, and some studies coming out of the US. The efficacy still ranges between roughly 70 to 96%. So the Pfizer vaccine is holding up. The Moderna studies show a little bit less, but again, much more study is needed. Some of those studies, we definitely need much more data, right? And for Johnson & Johnson, they're gathering data right now. Again, this is questions about efficacy against the Delta variant. Again, the more people this infects, the more chance to develop new variants, and that's the concern. So some of you on this town hall tonight are wondering about, you've heard or you've read or you've heard people talk about boosters. The CDC and the FDA came out with a joint statement just last week saying that while booster immunizations are being tested against the Delta variant, they are not needed at this time. And that's because we know that the level of antibodies that all three vaccines stimulate are very strong. They mount neutralizing antibody that grabs onto the virus and completely eliminates it from your body. So those antibodies are neutralizing the virus, and they do persist in your body for at least 6, if not 9 months. And again, from the phase 1, 2, and 3 trials, which started, as Dr. Hepburn is going to talk about, over a year ago, those people are being monitored long-term, and some of us, on this call have been vaccinated for 6 or more months. They're monitoring our antibodies. The antibodies do last a long time, and they inactivate the virus. So yes, you hear about boosters, but not at this time. Perhaps midwinter, perhaps next spring, we'll just have to see. So that's all I have, and I'll pass it off now to Dr. Hepburn.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I think great coverage, Jason, in terms of not much more to say about vaccines. I think one of my points that I'll get to is that as we learn more about these vaccines, I urge everybody to get their information from a credible source. And I think that's why these town halls, and that's why having experts in your community at the University of Toledo Medical Center is really a resource and a treasure that you can take advantage of. Privileged to join you again. Again, as Dr. Cooper mentioned, I was so honored to give the commencement address to the University of Toledo Medical School, and had a chance. I'm originally from just up the road in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and so it was great to be in your community. It was great to see the medical center, and frankly, the most inspiring thing was to see that next generation of healthcare professionals to graduate and to really get out there. In this case, a lot of those students, and I think it's really always worth reflecting on that the healthcare professionals at the University of Toledo Medical Center and in your communities have really been the heroes of this pandemic, literally risking their lives, literally working hours until they've been completely burned out to take care of people. And now it's been going on since last March. So it's really hasn't just been a sprint, it's been a marathon. So what I want to talk about a little bit, so thanks to them, and again, I'll say it a few times, but if for no other reason, get vaccinated so that those healthcare workers and heroes aren't going to be continually exposed to this horrible pandemic. It's one of many reasons to do so. So I wanted to highlight a couple I'll call it a good news of what I'm worried about and what you can do. And really to kind of start with the good news, I've had the privilege to work on the vaccine development at the federal government level since last May, and there's so many examples of where our governments, where our federal government or our state and local government have really not delivered on their promise to take care of the people of our nation. I think this is a good example of where we have. We were able to accelerate vaccine development against what all of the experts and naysayers said was impossible. And everybody said it was going to take 10 years. And literally having millions of doses available to the American people, not of one vaccine, but of 3 vaccines, it was an extraordinary accomplishment. It showed me what our government can do when it works well. It also shows me what the American people can do, because literally this was thousands and thousands of people volunteering for clinical trials and working in manufacturing plants, and ultimately distributing and administering these vaccines in your communities. And the local government, the local health department, the state health department in Ohio, all of these people demonstrated as a collective team that government can work and that we can deliver truly a life-saving vaccine to protect the American people. So I'm very proud of that, and I think I hope the listeners, the participants in this town hall, can sort of recognize that as American achievement. One of the particular components of that, there were many great things about it, but one of the particular components was medical research. It's really a triumph of why we do medical research in the first place, and why you have an academic medical center, why they should be funded, and why professionals in medical research should be nurtured and developed. And that's what, it was great to hear Dr. Cooper present about some of the cardiovascular and COVID research. It's so important. But it's something that we do really well. And I think it's an important message for the community that one of the things that's happened during this pandemic is that there has been a massive amount of information that we can track on a daily basis in our nation and really in the world in terms of number of cases and vaccine doses and the research associated with that. Are the vaccines safe? How protective are the vaccines? All the information that you saw Jason just present has been rolling out in record time. And it's because of medical research professionals making that information not only available to a community of experts, but publicly available. But we've developed a habit, if you will, both in the United States and the world, that once we have information about COVID and about these vaccines available, we make it publicly available. That type of transparency, I think, is such an important message, especially when we talk about vaccine hesitancy. I think it's really helpful to note that for these clinical trials to see if these vaccines were safe and effective, this information is publicly available. When the FDA reviews a product, they do an advisory committee meeting that all of that information is made publicly available. And so when there are issues of, well, we're not really sure how safe these vaccines are, and we're not sure if they're being studied, we really literally now have millions of people that have received these vaccines where we can understand how well they work and how long they work and all of that. For COVID, we don't have all the answers. And again, I think it's also helpful from a perspective standpoint that, you know, this is unprecedented. We've never as a nation really dealt with something like this before. We had a pandemic of influenza in 1918. That was different. Was catastrophic, like this one has been and is, but very different. I think the point is that in the medical research community, we've done so much great work. We're making this information public. And when people are trying to sort out vaccines and should I get a vaccine or not, and how does that work, and how protective is it, I think my advice to you is get your information from credible sources, and mechanisms like this town hall, I think, are extremely helpful. Now, what I am worried about is the Delta variant, and Jason presented it very eloquently, but here's the bottom line. This Delta variant has spread across the world at such an unprecedented pace. It's like nothing that I've ever seen. It started and we were tracking it in other countries, and all of a sudden it's the main strain in the United States. Just unprecedented. And so what it means is that, like with other aspects of the pandemic, we're always kind of moving in these uncharted waters and these surprises. So when you ask, how bad is Delta going to be? Is it going to be, are we going to have a horrendous fall wave? Well, I certainly hope not, but that's, you know, again, these things are sometimes unpredictable. I think what we can say with the Delta variant is that it is very, very contagious. And that if you are not vaccinated, even if you're a relatively young person, you could face some very severe health consequences, whether you get sick right away or whether you have long COVID afterwards, if you are unvaccinated and you're infected with the Delta variant. And so I think you'll hear from all of our professionals in this town hall. We're all extremely concerned about these trends, what it's done in other countries and now what it seems to be doing in the United States. So I'm very worried. Now, what can you do about it? I have 4 quick points for you, and then we'll turn it over to our next speaker. I think the first is to get vaccinated, and I think you've heard that message quite a bit. What I can say, just with my experience in working with these vaccines and the approvals over the past year, is that we have a massive amount of evidence, really an astounding amount of evidence of how protective they are at preventing someone from ending up in the hospital and from dying from COVID. They're just extraordinarily protective. And there are, you know, compared to any safety issues that are associated, it is so much worse to get COVID than to get vaccine. And so we urge you to please get vaccinated. Again, if not for yourself, for all the family and friends and all those people that you could be exposed to. And I always think, like, what a tragedy it would be if I was sick and if I then got somebody else sick, and I would want to do everything I could to prevent it. My second point is, what you can do is listen to credible sources. I've already made that point, and you're going to hear in your community from these credible sources. Please listen to them. When you ask a question like, am I going to need a 3rd dose of vaccine? It's actually a very complex question. If your immune system is not normal, you may need a 3rd dose of vaccine sooner. We're still trying to put all of this information available, but the credible sources are the ones that should guide you as we make those tough decisions and figure this out in the future. The third, and I'm really glad Dr. Cooper made this point about the cardiovascular effects of COVID. The third thing you can do is you can be healthy. Cardiovascular health, there's a lot of routine, very basic things that can make you very healthy. Your diet, your exercise significantly influences your cardiovascular health. And if you're in a very healthy state, if you get exposed to COVID, you're going to do much better. So those daily choices that you make can actually help you do better in case you ever have a COVID infection. And the final thing I would just say that you can do is you can take care of your people. Take care of your family, take care of your friends, take care of your community, especially if people are getting sick. Vaccine is one way you can do that, but it's also just being a good American and taking care of those around you like we do. So those are my comments. I'm going to hand it over now to the mayor. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Hepburn, and thank all of you for joining us tonight for this town hall. I have to say, initially, I was feeling a little self-conscious because I didn't have a PowerPoint presentation like the first two presenters did, but then Dr. Hepburn made me feel better by also not having a PowerPoint presentation. But I am all alone in that, among the presenters, in that I am at best a social scientist and not a real grown-up scientist like the previous speakers who speak so freely, complicated, mouthful medical terms with as many letters in them as my last name. I won't be able to do that. But what they did want me to speak to, and what I think I can speak to, is sort of the social, cultural, political impacts that COVID has caused our community and our region, and sort of what it has meant for our city, community in the last year and a half, and maybe where we go from here. Their first question that I was sort of asked specifically to address is, well, what was the community impact of COVID? Well, I suppose most bluntly, I could say that the most direct impact, the most heartbreaking impact would be the loss of 830 lives. That's how many deaths we've had in Lucas County as of today from COVID. And no matter what else we might say about the tumult that this has caused our social relationships, mental health, economic well-being, there's nothing that can replace those that we have lost and the pain that their families feel. But it is also true that this has presented more than merely a health challenge to communities. Just in terms of raw dollars and cents, I can tell you that the city of Toledo, a city that relies primarily on an income tax for the revenues it needs to hire police officers, firefighters, fix streets, and plow snow, and do all the things that we do. Our income tax collections were down by tens of millions of dollars last year, not just $1 million or $2 million, tens of millions of dollars. From the larger community economic impact, anecdotally, we all know stories of small businesses that seem uniquely negatively affected by this, just by their nature. Small businesses, even in the best of circumstances, 50% of all small businesses that are formed collapse within 3 years, and that's without a 100-year pandemic providing pressure upon them. Certainly, there has been economic trauma that they have faced, but even larger sort of institutions felt the impact. Here in Toledo, summertime and fall and into the winter, a lot of folks like to go watch a Mud Hens game or a Walleye game. Just the cancellation of those two seasons, the 2020 Mud Hen home season, and I believe there would have been 70 home dates, if I remember correctly, in a full Mud Hen season, and the cancellation of the Walleye 2020-2021 hockey season, which I think was about 40 home dates. Just those two entities having to cancel their seasons had a $52 million negative impact on our economy. Not just from the loss of ticket sales to those organizations, but obviously all the spin-off and the multiplier effect of the restaurants, bars, taverns, folks who own parking lots and things of that nature. Again, it might be a cliche, but it's true. There was an economic impact in addition to a health impact. I would go further, though, to say that there's a social impact that we are still trying to figure out, and it may be a long time before we do. I don't know, and I don't know if anyone knows, how to separate two very traumatic events that happened in our country last year from one another. And I am talking about COVID and the pandemic on one side, but also, the George Floyd murder and the, civil unrest and debate and repercussions from that event. Where I sit, they both happened in the same year and they were happening simultaneously. And I think now, even a year later, there are negative things happening, not just in our community, but across the country, that I think almost certainly are due to some combination of those two factors. And I don't, without an econometric analysis, I don't know if anyone can point precisely to a reason, but it cannot be, I don't care what anyone says, it can't be a coincidence that this past year of all years, 91 of the top 100 largest cities in the country, and I believe that's cities with populations of 150,000 and higher, 91 of those cities last year set all-time records for homicides. We have seen a heartbreaking spike in gun violence in Toledo too, certainly last year and now into this year. Is that because of changing attitudes toward police, which is more of a social justice, George Floyd, police community relations thing? Probably. But a big part of that, I am convinced, is the anxiety, sense of isolation, and maybe hopelessness that COVID caused. That's what I believe. We here in Toledo are finding in the last year a unique problem with what we call after-hour bars. Some people just call them illegal nightclubs, but essentially these are places that aren't permitted. No health inspector's gone through there, no fire inspector's gone through there. They're totally off the books. Not to be flippant about it, but they almost seem to be a modern equivalent almost of a speakeasy. I suppose they've always existed. We've noticed an explosion of them in the last year, because as restaurants and bars and other, concerts and, other entertainment venues closed, and even when they were open, they had distancing requirements and restrictions. Well, these sort of off the books illegal nightclubs that aren't really allowed to exist in the first place, obviously they don't care as much about the rules. And you put people into a setting like that where, alcohol and other things are flowing, you get bad outcomes. Now, those things might happen anyhow in any big city, and they do. But it can't be a coincidence that we've seen a spike in that and a spike in other types of crime, along with literally 91% of other cities, big cities in this country, from sea to shining sea, in this of all years, the year of the pandemic. I'm not writing an academic paper on it, and so some of this are just my own experiences, but common sense will tell you that there was more than just a health impact of COVID. There was social, cultural, economic, and changes in our behavior that it will take a long time for us to figure out. I don't know if we will ever quite go back, the era of the cross-country salesman, saleswoman might be gone forever. I don't know that you're ever going to get back on a plane in San Francisco and fly to New York City to make a presentation to the folks on Madison Avenue about how to sell your widget. That might always happen in a forum like that, and that will have impacts not just on the economy, but on organizations like mine. Again, if we're supported by an income tax, as I just mentioned earlier that we are, our income tax is applied based on where you live or where you work. Well, what happens if you live in Perrysburg and work in downtown Toledo? Well, we had been benefiting financially from that in the past, but in the future, someone might live in Perrysburg. They might work for Owens Corning, which is in downtown Toledo, but they may never leave their home in Perrysburg. We are less likely, the laws and norms are changing in such a way that we may be less likely to ever capture that income tax ever again. And I know some of you might be saying, oh, great, cry me a river. Benjamin Franklin was right. The only certainties in life are death and taxes. And I suppose I always knew that. I didn't realize until I took this job, most people prefer death to taxes. But the reality is those unexpected changes to our equation are going to affect, the number of police we can put on the street, number of fires we can put out, the amount of streets that we can plow, et cetera. Not saying it's good or bad, but to think that COVID was just about health is not telling the entire picture. Another question that they wanted me to address, and I can do this with a little more academic certainty than what I previously had provided, which is sort of generally my observations having been in the seat during this last year, are how are we doing? How are we doing here in Lucas County stacking up against our other peers around the state or in the state in general? I would say we're doing okay. We are just about at state averages, maybe a little less than state averages. So in the two categories that we want to think about, the percentages of those who have started the process of getting vaccinated. Here in Lucas County, it's about 47.3% have at least started the process, gotten a first shot, for instance. That is just a little bit below the state average, which is 48.5%. In the last day, 253 citizens of Lucas County have started the vaccination process. The total in our county who have started the vaccination process is over 204,000. Essentially, if you are over the age of 60 in Lucas County, your age group has been vaccinated at that 75% level or above, which is what we're shooting for. But if you are 59 or younger, you are in a age group that is not yet where we want to be. And the bell curve shows that most of the people who've started the vaccination process are between the ages of 50 and 59. Certainly the largest subset of any of them, but that would stand to reason because that's where we have the most citizens who exist. Of course, they would also have the highest raw percentage of those who started the vaccination process. The reality, though, is the older you are, the more likely you are to have been vaccinated. And I'm 48 years old, you sort of get to my age and younger, even folks 7, 8 years older than me and younger, our groups are not quite to that percentage that we've been shooting for. The other number we look at is, okay, how many people have completed the vaccination process, are totally done? The state average is 45.4%. Again, Lucas County becoming just a little bit below that. We're at 44.6%. Nothing to be really upset about, but we're not ahead of the curve by any means. In the last 24 hours, 273 more residents of our county have finished the vaccination process. The total in our county is 191,000. That's good. But again, the same age breakdowns as I gave you on the percentage who had started are found here again. So generally speaking, looking at my notes, if you are above the age of 60, you're 78.55% or higher to be in an age group that has been vaccinated. Once you get below the age of 60, the percentages go down to the point where teenagers are about 10%. Not surprising. This isn't surprising, but it just sort of confirms what we suspected from the outset, and that was when we began this effort, we thought that the first 30 to 37% would be pretty easy to get, that there were people who were desperate to get vaccinated. These are folks who had no problem wearing the masks, no problem with the restrictions, and would wait out in line for hours to get vaccinated. And that's true. The first 35, almost 40% of our population in Lucas County was vaccinated within the first 2.5, 3 weeks. But then what we suspected would happen has happened. And that is, once you get kind of that low-hanging fruit out of the way, it gets harder. All the people who wanted it, don't have any issues with the vaccine, aren't ideologically opposed to it, or religiously or politically opposed to it, for whatever reason, once they're done, it's harder and harder and harder to break through and get us to the percentages that we were shooting for, which is that 70%. We're finding that in addition to age, I talked about age, in terms of demographic groups that we're struggling to get vaccinated, they sort of come in two categories. One are communities of color in general. Again, I'm painting a broad brush here, but generally communities of color have been harder to vaccinate. There's a lot of reasons for that. You have, they tend, not exclusively of course, but often live in neighborhoods that are disinvested in, where it's harder for communications and social communicating networks maybe aren't what they could be. Let's be honest, sometimes there's not a lot of trust between those in authority and these communities. You don't have to go too far back to remember the Tuskegee experiments, unfortunately. And when someone knocks at the door and says, hey, I have a needle I'd like to stick in your arm, and trust me, this medicine will be good for you, that's not an easy lift in some neighborhoods. And I get it, but I think, but while it has been slow, there is incremental progress among communities of color. It's just, we got a lot of homebound, it's just hard, just structurally and logistically, it's hard. We're literally going door to door. We are taking some of our fire crews and other community volunteers, and we're knocking on doors and trying to spread the word that way. And we're picking up a little momentum, just not as quickly as we'd like. However, there's one other group that we are struggling to get vaccinated. And here the reasons are the demographic group is very different, and the reasons I think are different. These are white evangelical conservatives. They are just as resistant, we're finding from our data, to get vaccinated, but it's for far different reasons. This is a demographic that is just ideologically predisposed to, I don't know how to say it gently. I'm not quite sure what the audience is, so I'll just simply say white evangelical conservatives are not swarming to get in line. And maybe I'll just leave it at that. That's a bigger challenge, because we're finding that when we explain to communities of color the benefits, it's slow, it's hard work, but we're getting there. With white evangelical conservatives, we're not moving the needle at all. I don't know why. I know we live in politically divided times. There's no question. I don't know why everything has to become a political fight. I would have hoped and thought that something like this would not devolve into one. But the hysteria that took place in the last year over something as common sense as wearing a mask was disheartening to me. I understand those who have a worldview that government should have a limited role in our lives. I get it. But without being too flippant, I assume everyone here, or everyone that is wearing pants, okay? Why are you doing that? Because the government passed a law that says you should, all right? And it conformed to our sense of community values. Why the cloth we're wearing on the lower half of our bodies is just fine, but the little piece of cloth that we had to put over our nose and mouth turned into an affront to freedom itself and the vanguard of some coming tyrannical ideological takeover is beyond me. I don't think Paul Revere rode across Lexington Green all those years ago with an opinion about wearing a little piece of cloth on his nose, but I will leave it at that so I don't offend any more folks than I may already have. That's kind of the update on what this has meant socially, politically, culturally, economically to our community. We got a little more work to do, and I'm worried that this Delta variant is going to put us right back in the crosshairs of this same goofy ideological battle. And I hope we don't get there because we're so close to breaking free. But I know that people, as part of this town hall, will be aligned with me and others who are going to try to get our community to do the right thing. So thank you for the invite. I hope that was somewhat what I was supposed to say. And if not, I apologize. Oh, and now I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, who's going to lead a Q&A, and it is Dr. Duggan.
Thank you so much, Mayor. That was outstanding. And thank you to all of the panelists. Excellent, excellent discussion. I'm going to throw the first question to Dr. Cooper. So given the information you've given us about the kind of complications that can happen post-COVID and for cardiac, what about my kid wanting to play competitive sports this fall? What if they've had symptomatic COVID, asymptomatic COVID? What if they've had a Kawasaki's like complication? And I know this is a tough one, but I'm a parent. What should I do?
Yeah, so I wrote something about this in the chat box if anybody wants to look at that, but I'll briefly describe it. So first things first, if your kid or even an adult develops COVID, you should just take it easy for a little bit. And my own son developed COVID earlier this year, and what the general recommendation is, 14 days off sports activities to let your body recover. I think what we've seen is that from studies which are continuing to evolve, like amongst professional athletes, the rate of serious cardiovascular consequences of people who recover from COVID are pretty rare. Myocarditis, this problem with the heart muscle, in the well less than 1% range. And so if somebody's recovered from COVID and they're doing fine and they feel fine, they can probably return to normal physical activity, including sports. What I would say, though, is that there are some people that have what Dr. Hepburn referred to as long haulers, people who have continued symptoms, maybe it's shortness of breath. Those folks probably ought to be evaluated before they return to sports activities. And certainly anybody who has a concerning symptom, so chest pain, we are concerned about, ongoing shortness of breath. If you get dizziness, blackout, or pass out, that can be a sign of a cardiovascular problem. You ought to be evaluated. Finally, for folks like I mentioned, some children will develop Kawasaki's disease. If you have a cardiovascular problem and you've had COVID, before you return to sports or to vigorous physical activity, you need to be seen by a heart specialist or some kind of professional who's in the spot of evaluating people with cardiovascular problems who want to exercise. You need to be evaluated and then get a formal exercise prescription or formal guidance before you begin doing that kind of stuff. So I hope that helps. So most people, they're fine to return to physical activity, the vast majority. But if you got ongoing symptoms, you need to be checked out. And if you do have a problem, you need to get somebody to really evaluate you carefully.
Perfect. My next question is going to go to Dr. Hepburn. We've got a question in the chat box and it's a very good one. It also touches on some of the stuff that the mayor was talking about. What kind of lessons can we pull from past pandemics like the Spanish flu, smallpox eradication? Civil wars were stopped to let the smallpox vaccinators move through in the 60s and 50s and 60s in Africa. What lessons can we learn? What can we try to do at this time of crisis? And I'll throw that open to everybody after Dr. Hepburn and the mayor have spoken.
Yeah, and I'd actually start with a message of hope, maybe, and then we can turn it over, because I think we live in very divided times, and the news is full of this people fighting with those people and all of the controversies, and those exist. But I'm really glad you brought up the eradication of smallpox. That was a campaign that was developed after a highly effective vaccine. was manufactured and distributed worldwide. And it was literally the effort of millions of public health professionals that vaccinated the world. And even when not all the world was vaccinated, they were able to see if people got sick, track down those cases, and vaccinate everybody around them so that we were able to truly eliminate an infectious disease. I mean, we can do that globally. I'm frankly, I'm very proud. One of the things you're seeing us do as a nation now is we're sending doses to other countries where we have more than enough doses. Now we are sending doses to many countries all over the world that are still having outbreaks. And we're going to keep doing that because it's not only the right things to do, that's what we do as Americans, but also because the way that this pandemic ends is to get the world vaccinated. So we can learn those lessons. And I think the commitment that stops pandemics is community cooperation. It's us working together. So we can use the 1918 Spanish flu as an example. We can use more recent examples where we've come together and we've worked together as a community to do that. I think the most obvious example right now is we have to get our communities vaccinated. They're just the numbers are just too low. They're just too low. And why aren't people getting vaccinated? It's really complex. I don't know. But what I do know is that if people hear that they should get vaccinated from people they trust, emphasize that word trust, the chances of them getting vaccinated just skyrocket. And so those types of community efforts built on communication from people that they trust, I think that's our best near-term objective and goal that's going to get us through the next few months.
Mayor, any additional thoughts on that?
The very last thing that Dr. Hepburn said was what I was going to say. The word that comes to mind for me is trust. That's the word. That's the only thing that will get this job done. And that is, unfortunately, we have a trust gap in major institutions that we never used to have it in. So when we talk about how we rallied and, we eradicated smallpox or polio vaccine or whatever it was, that frankly, that was back in an era where folks generally trusted the government and they generally trusted the media and they generally trusted the major institutions of American life. We're not there right now. And so the trick here is finding voices in the lives of people who are reluctant, that are trustworthy to them, to preach the gospel of vaccination. So I can predict it won't be anyone from government, and it might not be anyone from the media. And in certain cases, I mean, it looks like they're trying to impeach Fauci or some crazy, it might not even be anyone in the health profession, but it could be a cousin, a pastor, your daughter's soccer coach. I mean, that's what we need to do. Now, how we get at that, I don't know, but it's absolutely all about trust. And it probably won't come from the typical institutions that organize American life. So we're going to have to get creative and figure out how we build and achieve trust among folks who, are cynical and often with good reason.
So then this is the final. This is the final question, because I know I think we're running a little bit late.
Joan, can I just make one comment to leverage both of the two prior speakers regarding the trust aspect? Dr. Hepburn mentioned this, and I want to make this so abundantly clear for everybody who's on the call. Like the Pfizer vaccine, that trial was 43,000 people, carefully followed, randomized, half got vaccine, half didn't, followed the outcome. There's ongoing follow-up on those people. And then we have what's called post-surveillance studies on literally hundreds of millions of people. What we know is the vaccines are safe, period. The vaccines are safe, and they are far, far, far safer than getting COVID, right? And so the one thing that the American people, that the people of our planet need to understand is that these vaccines have been tested. They've been supervised. Those tests have been supervised in randomized studies. And then we've followed hundreds of millions of people who've now received the vaccines. And so that's the one piece where we need to develop the trust is follow the science.
So this last question for everybody is kind of a constellation of a number of questions that have been in the chat box and the pre-registration. And somebody put it into the chat box. Here it is for each of you. Who do you trust? Where do you go for your truth? The Pediatric Society of, American Board of Pediatrics, CDC, FDA, the drug companies, my next door neighbor. Who do you believe? Where do you go for truth? So we'll start with Dr. Huntley, Dr. Hepburn. We'll go backwards. Dr. Huntley, Dr. Hepburn, Dr. Cooper, and the mayor.
I absolutely trust, and you saw it today, I absolutely trust the CDC in terms of data about current infections and vaccination. It's all there. And following up on what Dr. Cooper said, if you also get questions about what is in the vaccine, it's there. Adverse reactions, it's there. Trust the CDC.
Excellent. Dr. Hepburn?
Agree. And I do want to go back to my previous point, though, is that it's on the CDC website. I mean, it is available to all of us, and the publications are all freely available. They're out there, and there's really this continuous stream of the information, I think, which emphatically make that point. I think what I'm asking though is that I really think that our healthcare community can synthesize those informations, our public health departments, and it starts at the CDC, but it's, there are professionals that have been doing this, and I understand the reluctance of, well, I'm not really sure about this or that, but they're not only taking all of that information, which is already out there public, but they're synthesizing it with decades of experience too. So, again, the public health and healthcare communities is who I think you should trust.
Perfect. Mayor, and I assume you're going to say that our Lucas County Public Health Department is an excellent source, but.
Well, sure it is. Sure it is. I know your question is who do I trust, but I don't represent the target group that we're worried about. I was one of those people waiting in line to get vaccinated, and I got it right away, and so did my wife, and so did my 2 teenage kids. I mean, I'm all in. Of course, I'm a science guy. The better question is what will convince folks in those two groups? Communities of color, white evangelical, conservatives. Those are the problem areas. And if someone has the answer to that, then we'll be making some progress. We had a high-ranking elected official last year who suggested we drink bleach, and half the country nodded in agreement. I mean, that's a problem. And so, yeah, I can tell you all day. Of course, CDC. I'm not, the problem are those folks who are inclined to drink bleach because their guy told them to. And that's these numbers aren't moving. Okay, we got a problem here. And so we got to find what's going to move the needle on those folks who are not getting vaccinated.
And I'll turn it over for the last word to Dr. Cooper. What's your source of truth and where do you go?
Look, the United States is fortunate to have the best disease surveillance program in the entire world. It's no exaggeration. It's the Centers for Disease Control, and they put out weekly updates well before the pandemic, and medical professionals have trusted them forever. We're also blessed with the best healthcare research infrastructure in the entire planet. It's the envy of all countries, the National Institutes of Health, and our professional leaders at the NIH and the scientists like Dr. Huntley and others who do research funded by the NIH are the envy of the entire world. So those are two sources. As we get into some of our specific areas, I've served on the board of directors at the American College of Cardiology, and we have those kind of groups which are professionals in our specialties, which get together regularly to debate the medical literature and help develop policies and procedures for our patients. The American College of Cardiology is the envy of the world for cardiology. We have many international members now. The American Heart Association, which raises money and supports heart and cardiovascular research around the country, I trust them. Locally, we're blessed with Toledo, Lucas County Health Department. Dan Cadigan, the medical director, I've known Dan for several decades as a practicing physician in our community, salt of the earth guy, great doctor, has stepped forward to serve in the pandemic as the medical director. You know, a great organization trying to do the right thing. And so I think that, you know, on a national level, on a specialty level, on a local level, there's lots of trustable people. However, to the mayor's comments, I think we just have to keep the message coming. We have to be consistent about the message. We can't vary, and then we have to reach out to people who don't necessarily agree with this, so that we can give them solid information, and hopefully, eventually, we'll get there. Right? The science will win. The science always wins.
All right, back to you, Dr. Cooper, to close us out.
Yeah, so I just want to say thank you to all of our participants today. You know, you've given up your valuable time. Dr. Hepburn, you know, you're leading one of the most important national programs, our vaccine program, and to get an hour of your time is more than gold. Mayor, you lead our city, which leads our community and our region. Thanks for all that you do. I hope you know that people like myself and others greatly appreciate your leadership during this difficult time. We're behind you in the things that you're doing to make our community better. Jason and the team that does the research, Joan, the group who takes care of all these COVID patients. You know, poor Joan is, you know, Saturdays and Sundays at people's bedsides taking care of sick people. Know that that we're all greatly appreciative. And to our participants, just share the message. You know, we'll come back at you again with another update in a month or two. I'm sure things will change. Share the message with people. Don't be shy about it. Let folks know that the science is behind vaccinations, and that the University of Toledo and the city of Toledo and the federal government, we're all behind making a healthier, more just world. So thank you so much.